Democrats. Yeah. Further debate? Further debate? Minister of Tourism and Culture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted to rise in the House today to join the important debate on Bill 174, Speaker. In doing so, I want to thank members of this House. Join the member for Kitchener-Conestoga. I understand the member of Essex was on his feet earlier. And Speaker, I want to send a special note of thanks and respect to my colleague, the member for Vaughan, the Minister of Transportation, for his partnership and his ongoing work and what has become an incredibly important piece of legislation, Speaker. You know, careless driving, I'm going to focus my comments on careless driving in my remarks today in the time that I have, Speaker. Members of this House may remember that in June of 2016, I introduced Bill 213, the Highway Traffic Act Amendment. That was last year, Speaker, in June of 2016. It was legislation that would seek to enhance sanctions for careless driving, including enhanced penalties for careless driving, cause death, or bodily harm, and in fact would create 2 new charges in the Highway Traffic Act for the first time, Speaker. The impetus for this legislation was twofold and emanated from a very personal tragedy in my life, as members of this House will know, Mr. Speaker. On June 6, 2006, my late husband was an OPP Sergeant, Greg Stauber. He was killed riding his bicycle north of our home in Milton, Speaker. And the gentleman who killed him was charged with careless driving. As a consequence of that, his sentence included 100 hours of community service and a further suspension of his license. He already had, at the time, several convictions, in fact 5 for driving under suspension, 4 for driving with no license, and was what many would say a repeat offender in the system, Speaker, someone who continually drove as though the consequences didn't matter. And so I sought to update the Highway Traffic Act and give it teeth and consequences. And so reforming behaviour means creating consequences, Speaker. The second impetus for this legislative change was as a consequence of the tools that officers need. I'm grateful to my late husband for the many times that he came home on his duties when he was on the road, Speaker, and told me how frequently careless driving felt like a tool for him that didn't have enough teeth or meaning. It was a legislative charge, until now, I'm happy to say, Speaker, that wasn't terribly meaningful, nor did it have a great deal of specificity or teeth. Consequently, officers use it quite often, and I have to say, Speaker, very often, and the consequences, of course, which is why we're here, are not very meaningful for those who lose a loved one who's killed or severely injured. And so to my friend, Sergeant Brett Carson, the Highway Safety Division of the OPP, I owe a debt of gratitude, because it was Brett whose advice as a sergeant on the road, a collision reconstructionist with 25+ years experience, and an officer who has adjudicated many cases. It was his experience that helped me to think through the kind of meaningful tool, and the Minister of Transportation referenced this, Speaker, the kind of meaningful tool that we needed to give officers in the consequence and in the execution of their duty. And so at its heart, the amendments that we're proposing, Bill 174, the changes to the Highway Traffic Act, 2 new charges, are at its heart targeted at vulnerable road users. Why, Mr. Speaker? Well, when I tabled my bill, I had at the news conference Constable Hugh Smith, who's now retired from the Metro Toronto Police Service. And at the press conference, Hugh, who had 30+ years as a sergeant on the road, said that in thousands of careless driving cases that he had made or allocated on in court or given evidence in, not one of the people who had been convicted of careless and killed someone had ever gone to jail or, in his view, had received significant consequences. And I think that's incredibly telling. Constable Smith was also responsible, incidentally, for cycling enforcement in the Toronto Police Service. And so, as I have, and of course by personal experience, had adjudicated a number of cycling and pedestrian deaths with little satisfaction to the survivors who remained, with the charge of careless that, again, until now, I'm happy to say, Speaker, had very little teeth and very little meaning. You know, this ability for a sentence to include remedies like driver training, and this has been talked about, Speaker, remains. These are important penalties, and they are still there. They remain there. They are in the purview of a judge. In fact, it is within the judge's discretion to do that. What we are trying to do, and I'm glad to hear members of this House speak to it, Speaker, is create the toughest penalties in Canada. When passed, this law will create 2 new charges, as I've mentioned. Careless driving caused death, and careless driving caused bodily harm, thus giving officers the tools that they need to keep our roads safe, thus giving them the tools that they need to give satisfaction to loved ones who remain, that in some way, shape, or form, the maximum penalties allowed under the Act are going to apply. And I can tell you, Speaker, as a survivor of a terrible collision like this, it's extraordinarily meaningful when, as a legislator now, I can stand in this place and speak to a law that is incredibly important to me personally. And so, Speaker, I know that my time has run out, but it's been my privilege to join this debate with the other legislators in this place to ensure that we have a law that meets the requirements, that speaks to those who are left behind, but also to those we have lost. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.